I think there's another factor here, and Rich touched on it in reference to the Soviet Union. Bill always talked about ordered liberty, and throughout his public life, which started here at Yale, he talked about the Western tradition and about America as a particularly stunning example of that tradition. So even though he identified himself as a libertarian, and even though, as someone else mentioned, he wouldn't have said, well, I'm a Burkean, but still, the tradition, the Western tradition, was a very big part of his intellectual and personal makeup. So he was inoculated by those things, I believe.
You know, one thing, we all act in hindsight as if this was a doctrinal exercise of surgical precision. When I was there in the early 60s, no one knew what a conservative was. We were making it up week by week. I remember the first time Frank Meyer came in, who's the father of fusionism, and he laid out the full thing with, you know, graphs and reading lists, and here's how we're going to put together the traditionalists and the libertarians and the national security types, and this will be one tight bond, and we'll march forward into the bright future. I'm sure I wasn't the only one in the room who thought it was preposterous. Jim Burnham always accused me. I always tried to accuse somebody else. But somebody came up with a line which kind of stopped even Frank Meyer for a second. Frank Meyer could not easily be stopped. And someone said, "You mean, Frank, you're going to make the holy rollers lie down with the high rollers?" Frank drew on his Princeton background, his Balliol background, author of 7 books, and said roughly, "Abba dabba 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 dabba." So, the glue that held the idea of modern conservatism together was communism. The religious people, the economic people, the security people, they all knew who the enemy was. The trick for these gentlemen is to find the glue going forward. And we've kind of zigged and zagged, and maybe we'll zag to triumph. Hope so.
I think you've given us the clue. The key is the high roller, holy roller alliance, and I think I just call it the roller party. And each side can think it's their kind of rolling. But the question. Just thinking a minute more while Neil was talking about the question. If I could take another second, I do think I didn't know Bill nearly as well as many people in this room, but Bill was not a hater at all, and I think rather disliked haters, if I could say, and disliked conspiratorialists. And I think that aspect of, not to speak ill of the dead, but that aspect of the kind of Murray Rothbard strain of libertarianism, and to some degree of Ron Paul for that matter, would really have put him off. I mean, I don't even like that Bill purged the Birchers. I mean, it's not quite right. I mean, Bill was, in that respect, speaking not just personally. I don't agree with, Robert Welch. He was sort of saying they can't be part of the conservative movement if the conservative movement's going to be serious and respectable. But that was because the Birchers were crazy. I mean, and if you read, they thought, that they were some of their particular policies in terms of let's have, stronger defense policy, people could agree with. But the actual analytical claim that Dwight Eisenhower was a knowing agent of the communist conspiracy is nuts. And Bill Buckley thought you really don't want to have a political movement that is friendly to people who are saying things that are nuts, and not just nuts in the sort of harmless nuts way of, I have slightly a cranky view of economic policy, and I'm going to, but really, but saying about people who had served their country pretty impressively and honorably that they were traitors. I mean, that's what the Birchers said.
Half of any issue of National Review is written by harmless nuts. So
yeah,
we have
exactly.
No problem.
And the Weekly Standard. But I think that really offended Bill. And I went back and reread at some point, I can't remember how it came up a year or two ago, you reposted on the website the 1963 3, I guess it was, or 2, denunciation of the Birchers. And it's quite detailed and substantive. It's not just, these people are terrible, I'm excommunicating them. And he quotes Welch at great length and just shows that this is an untenable argument. And not just untenable, but as I say, sort of, it transforms a difference of opinion, a difference of strategy and tactics, even a difference in values, into a kind of, in Welch's case, a denunciation of people as kind of evil when that was not the case. And I think that really, so that part of, I think Bill always had a distaste for, and I think it was a wise distaste for those aspects. I mean, this always happens in politics on all sides. There's a certain temptation to transform a difference of opinion into a evil motive on the part of the other side, or to turn a bad policy that you think really is doing damage to one that people consciously are pursuing in order to do damage to the country. There are such people, and Bill wasn't scared to denounce, Soviet spies and to denounce actual witting agents of the communist conspiracy. But I think he thought it was important to draw the line against those who were using that kind of rhetoric in the name of the conservative movement.
We republished that editorial just to kick the Birchers while they're down. It's like 30 years later, we really meant it, okay?
Yes.
This may be a logical following on, to that subject, but I'd really like your thoughts, since this panel is about energizing and re-energizing the conservative movement, the role of conservative talk radio in that. And if you set aside your whatever biases come out of the fact that you all are primarily print journalists, at least as I was listening to the themes of if you like, values that Bill Buckley represented, certainly conservative talk radio does not suffer from humility. But it also doesn't seem to be much of a big tent. It seems to be very doctrinaire and attacking deviation from sort of a fairly narrow line. And I'm throwing that out more to get your reaction to, but more generally in the concept, is this, or are there things that you would do differently in some way of energizing a conservative movement, or do you see this as a mostly valuable and constructive role?
Actually, we have a pretty full file of Bill's views on these things. He reached out to many of them, became friendly with half a dozen of them, thought they were a critical element, but thought that it put an even greater burden on the gyroscopic function performed by the print guys. And if there is an imbalance in the public conversation and the totality of conservative expression is blaring from that particular megaphone, I don't think it serves us well. Bill's view was that they were tactical allies, but not great strategic assets. And of course, he was a great taxonomist. I remember one of the last times I saw him, he was going through, from Hannity to Limbaugh to Laura to the rest of them, and he had a really crisp and focused view of each one. I don't know how he did that. For most of his life, he worked 18 hours a day. That was one way he would have done it. But in those days, I'm not sure how he got so informed about talk radio, but he knew it well.
Yes.
Two things. Number one, I wanted to point out that not only did Bill Buckley start his career here at Yale on the floor of the YPU, but he also had his last public speech here about a year and a half or two before he passed away, also just down the street from here, and I was in attendance that day. Second, question for Mr. Freeman. If he were still around, would he have met with Ron Paul for lunch? And if he did meet with him, or if he didn't, what sort of pithy saying would he have about him afterwards?
Well, he knew Ron Paul, had him on firing line. If you're YouTube savvy, you can see a really interesting exchange between the two of them. The reason I think he never sidled up to Ron Paul is for the reason that Bill mentioned, that absolutism of any kind was off-putting to him. He was always laying down the predicate. He saw it as his duty to sort of define the conservative paradigm. But he always was flexible within it. And people who were inflexible on whatever the issue. I mean, I had to be the tip of the spear in the Ayn Rand campaign. And I confess, I went into battle for Bill and slayed the dragon, but I did not read Atlas Shrugged until last winter. And I hereby apologize to the late Miss Rand. The book has some merit. But Bill, I always thought his principal gripe with Ayn Rand was her atheism. And it triggered a response that had been bred in Bill from the time he was baptized. He just went after her. But also, she was an absolutist, and that was off-putting.